So I'm very happy I'm Dr. Melanie Barham. I'm the Animal Health Canada Executive Director, and I'm very happy to welcome you to one of our, I think it's our third or fourth division and project update for stakeholders. So today's agenda will be introducing, this will be the NFACC, the National Farm Care Council update, and given by Jackie Wetbrook, and then we'll also have an Animal Health Canada update, and then we will also have some networking if you want to stick around, which will be, it's been fun. We've had lots of good conversations, and happy to continue those. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jackie Wetbrook. So Jackie is our NFACC General Manager. Oh, and I'm going to ask that if you're not speaking, if you could please put your microphones on mute, and maybe Sam, if you can monitor that, that would be great. So Jackie has been with NFACC, I understand, since 2005, long before my term here, but since the beginning of NFACC, and has been with the organization since that time. So there's no better person to speak about NFACC than her, and I'm very pleased to welcome her to give the update on what NFACC has been up to and what's on the horizon for them. So Jackie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Melanie. Thanks for that introduction. All right, so I think I'm going to show my screen, and let's see if this works. So I think you should be seeing my screen. I'm also going to turn off video, just because sometimes my audio is not so great when I'm showing my screen.
We can see the French slides.
Okay. Well, it shows me that I'm showing my screen.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. Pardon me.
Okay. You're on French. All right. Are we good to go?
We're all good. Sorry about that, Jackie.
Awesome. No problem at all. All righty. So thanks so much for the opportunity. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about NFACC and to provide updates and then answer any questions that anyone has. So just to start off with a bit of a presentation overview. So this webinar is going to be broken into two main parts, and part one is going to focus on NFACC as an organization, so outlining who's involved, what the organization does and how, along with some recent challenges and the approach being taken to address them. And then part two of this presentation is going to focus on a major project funded through CAP, so the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, called Advancing Animal Welfare and Public Trust Through Codes of Practice. And that project is administered by Animal Health Canada, and it aims to develop or update several codes of practice. NFACC is a forum where diverse groups that would not interact with each other come together to address farm animal welfare. And this is done via a few channels or avenues. So of course, NFACC's processes for developing codes of practice and animal care assessment programs is one avenue for diverse stakeholders to come together and determine what the standard of care ought to be for farm animal welfare, along with how those standards are going to be measured. As well, around the NFACC table, there are opportunities created to have conversations with those who are going to see farm animal welfare somewhat differently, and to build the relationships and trust beyond our normal echo chambers on this topic. So it's really important to note that NFACC is an organization of process. So NFACC itself does not create the codes or animal care assessment programs. NFACC creates the processes by which those with the jurisdiction, the influence, or the responsibilities in farm animal welfare can come together to develop those codes of practice or those animal care assessment programs. So in other words, what ought to be the standard of care, and how do we measure it? The aim is to find that sweet spot of constructive tension where we are collectively progressing on farm animal welfare, while at the same time maintaining the viability of Canadian animal agriculture. So NFACC itself is not one person or one entity. It is everybody created to achieve what no one group could do on its own. So these are NFACC's primary members. All 28 are board members. Everyone has a role to play in accordance with their sphere of influence, responsibility, or jurisdiction, and we need everyone to fully engage and take ownership of their role in farm animal welfare, while also keeping in mind that we are looking to maintain the viability of Canadian animal agriculture. And NFACC's membership reflects the various influencers and interests in farm animal welfare, from welfare groups to farmers, from veterinarians to processors, from governments to retailers and restaurant groups. And the aim is to use this diversity of experience, knowledge, and perspectives to build processes that are fully informed by an array of considerations that no one group would fully be able to encompass on their own. NFACC also has a growing list of associate members, and so while we have a huge board, and NFACC meetings can certainly feel like mini conferences, our associate members who are technically observers at NFACC meetings are always encouraged to make their views known, and those insights are always appreciated and encouraged and valued. The growth of the associate membership category is largely by word of mouth. So NFACC itself doesn't have any kind of membership recruitment. Our resources are really limited. And so the growing associate membership is really by word of mouth for the most part. I want to spend a little bit of time also speaking to the operations of NFACC around the executive. And so we have quite a large executive also at NFACC. And so while NFACC's board, that big 28-person board, is responsible for governing the organization by establishing broad policies and objectives, approving the annual budget, accounting to NFACC's members for the organization's performance. So are we, are they going to keep paying their membership fee? And also the oversight of the executive. NFACC's executive handles the more day-to-day activities related to overseeing me as the general manager and our new associate general manager, Carolyn Ramsey, as well as the more day-to-day financial oversight. They also act as a sounding board for developing policy proposals for the board's consideration. And so the executive is kind of a mini microcosm of the diversity around the full NFACC board and acts as that initial filter through which all issues and policies are channeled to deliver on NFACC's goals, and then also NFACC's objectives related to codes of practice, the animal care assessment programs, building value and recognition of NFACC, and communicating about NFACC as well. NFACC's operations are funded through membership fees. And so every member and associate member of NFACC, save for government and our researcher rep, contribute to NFACC's annual budget. And this is something that is really important to keep in mind, especially when we do see media articles that refer to NFACC as being this taxpayer-funded entity. It is membership dollars that keep NFACC operations going. All right, so this is an excerpt from NFACC's business plan related to decision-making. So NFACC does use a consensus decision-making model, reserving voting for what we refer to in the business plan as quote-unquote matters of day-to-day activities such as maintenance of project work plans or items related to the Secretariat of NFACC. The reality is that we almost never move forward on an issue if one member has significant reservations. And the executive is used as that initial filter for any policy or proposal before a recommendation goes to the board. So given the diversity of stakeholders on the executive, recommendations that come from the executive are generally the result of rigorous deliberations, which is critical for decision-making once a proposal reaches the large NFACC board, which must also arrive at consensus. So what do we mean by consensus? Well, while we do operate by consensus, that doesn't mean that everyone is cheering every decision. Consensus at NFACC requires members to look at the greater good and to sometimes support or even at least not stand in the way of directions they might not otherwise be inclined to agree with wholly, but that they can live with. And vice versa, it requires each member to be respectful when another member simply cannot support an initiative. So we keep the conversation going and try to build that comfort level. And this model for decision-making has ensured that minority voices around NFACC are heard and are empowered. While a major criticism of NFACC has always been that it is quote-unquote industry heavy, the reality is that our decision-making model has been an equalizer amongst all NFACC members. And this approach has certainly served NFACC well since 2005, which is when we got off the ground. But of late, we are finding that we need to revisit how we engage and arrive at consensus. So, as we do at NFACC, we start by having conversations. We've had a lot of conversations at NFACC of late about some of the challenges we're currently facing in finding common ground on animal welfare, what's precipitated these challenges, and what ought we to do about them. And There has been agreement that we would start off with some facilitated focus groups as a first step in finding a path forward. So, you know, what can we agree to? Do we have enough common ground to rebuild our relationships? So NFACC contracted a specialist with over 25 years of experience in community engagement, facilitation, coaching, and leadership of high stakes, high emotion conversations. And animal welfare is definitely a high emotion conversation. The work began with an anonymous survey where NFACC's members could share their confidential views about their experiences at NFACC. And the results were then summarized in the report that you see on the screen here, Understanding Challenges, Finding a Way Forward. And while the report itself is internal to NFACC members, 5 key themes emerged. So NFACC is unique, groundbreaking, and a model for collaboration in times of divide. And people are pretty darn proud of that. We've done some great work together, and people are pretty darn proud of that as well. They're very proud of what's been accomplished. We actually need each other. And I'd like to suggest that if we really are concerned about farm animal welfare, the animals themselves really need us human beings to figure this out as well. There are some deep rifts and challenges that need to be addressed, and that's completely not surprising. It's perfectly natural for any organization to have conflict, to have differences of opinion, let alone an organization that seeks to engage where normally there always is conflict and where there is a diversity of views. And no surprise, this is hard, challenging work. It requires each of us to be our best selves in an effort to have better and harder conversations. So the next step after the survey and report that followed that were the actual focus groups. And they were held via Zoom in 2 3-hour workshops. Workshop 1 focused on how we work together, explaining the science of strong groups, how to have hard conversations, how to disagree well, and better understanding the science around emotions and their impact upon us. Workshop 2 is where the work began on examining NFACC's code of conduct, our goals and core values to determine if there was indeed enough common ground to keep working together. And spoiler alert, there is. And what that work will entail. So what are the next steps? Where to from here? So people were really eager to keep the conversation going, even if it was hard. It was really enlightening for a lot of people, and they felt like they were just scratching the surface and they wanted to dig in deeper. We're a little bit like the Tower of Babel. We may be using the same words, but they have different meanings to different groups. So there definitely is a need to have more conversations and build a more common understanding around terminology and what we're going to do them together. And parallel to having better conversations that build understanding is the need to clarify the protocols for making decisions at NFACC. Some assumptions have been made, and we need to be a little bit better on having processes in place to help guide us in our decision making. So here we have the cover page of NFACC's business plan and governance document. And this document is to be updated as needed, but reviewed at least every 2 years. And the core version of this business plan was developed back in 2016, subsequent to a major strategic planning initiative. And since then, the business plan has been supplemented with additional policies, the most substantive coming from what could be framed as a mini strategic planning initiative that we called the Essence of NFACC project. And that was undertaken in 2018 and led to quite a bit of supplemental work on the business plan. And so all of the more recent activities that I've just covered off that have happened in 2021 and moving into 2022 with respect to the broad survey that we did with NFACC members that led to that report around understanding challenges and finding a path forward, the subsequent focus groups, exercises, and our upcoming governance review are all really timely and in keeping with what should be NFACC's normal schedule of strategic planning. So the next steps on the governance review include confirming the scope. So how big and broad are we going to go on our governance review, and engaging a governance specialist in that regard. And then underpinning the entirety of a governance review is really a clear understanding on the decision-making approach NFACC will utilize as it will inform the rest of the governance review. So we are envisioning a workshop for initiating this prerequisite step, and there's a lot of work going on in that regard as well. So before I turn to an update on the project in animal welfare public trust through codes of practice, I want to touch a bit upon why it's so important to spend the time to get our approach to decision making and governance right at NFACC. So NFACC was formed rather organically. It developed through the really good instincts of many of those original people that came together from across several sectors. And over the years, NFACC has become what has been termed a successful social precipitate. So in other words, a collaborative organization of really highly diverse stakeholders that have engaged through careful facilitation and a lot of organizational support. The original planning and development of NFACC made it a compelling organization to join, notably for organizations that were not naturally inclined to come together. So that the natural polarization tendencies of groups that are not naturally inclined to come together are always at play. They are always going to be at play, and we need to ensure that we have a way to manage that. The potentially destructive or polarizing tendencies really need to be supplanted by a well-balanced unifying tension based on everyone's collective realization that despite our differences, there is value in supporting collective progress and embracing that constructive tension. So getting comfortable with being uncomfortable and recognizing that is really the best path forward for resolving farm animal welfare challenges that we face. And the risk and challenge is in avoiding the destructive tensions that threaten to undermine our advances in farm animal welfare. And we know that it's generally acknowledged that we are living in a more polarized environment these days. So NFACC itself is really an effort in human nature. However, there is a lot of really good research around the value of having socially diverse groups, and that socially diverse groups are more innovative than homogenous groups. So our tendency as human beings is certainly to gravitate towards those who see the world in a similar way to the way we see it. That's our comfort zone. That's where we like to be. And we resist spending time with people who see the world very differently because it makes us uncomfortable. It challenges us, and we can all relate to that stomach turning or the anxiety that we feel when we hear an opinion that is really counter to our own. And certainly social media algorithms and the pandemic have further exacerbated this tendency. However, we miss a huge opportunity to advance farm animal welfare when we're talking about social diversity while maintaining the viability of Canadian animal agriculture when we become insular and only communicate in echo chambers. Socially diverse groups that are supported in coming together, and that's key. We just don't throw people together. There need to be supports in place. Those kinds of efforts tend to result in the best outcomes. And so why is that? It's interesting. It's not magic. The research actually shows that a certain level of discomfort makes us work harder to come up with novel solutions to intractable problems. We expect to be challenged because we're not amongst our cohorts that we would have expected to agree with us. So we actually work harder to prepare, and we don't make assumptions. We don't assume that someone's going to see the world the same way as we do. So we actually think more critically, and then in turn, we're challenged to think more critically. So it is the hard work. It's not in our comfort zone. But what's really interesting from the research is that when presented with a problem, homogeneous groups are less likely to arrive at the correct solution. However, and this is really, really fun, they tend to be more confident in the rightness of their wrong answer. And so there's a cognitive bias and a false confidence amongst homogenous groups. And certainly we've all experienced this. I like to get together with my friends and solve the world's problems over a beer or wine. And hey, every solution looks simple. And unfortunately, I'm probably coming up with the wrong solution. On the other hand, socially diverse groups are more likely to come up with the right answer when given a problem to solve. But what's really interesting here is that they're less confident and less certain of the rightness of their answer. So in coming up with the right answer, socially diverse groups have in essence developed more expertise as they have more fully explored possible outcomes. They start to see all the gray in an issue. And that comes as a result of having been more challenged by the diversity of the perspectives within their group. So in fact, if we're aiming to support good outcomes for animals and for animal agriculture as a whole, this requires us to embrace the constructive tension that's necessary to resolve these intractable problems. And ultimately, we know that if this were easy, the solutions would already be in place. All right, so up until this, I talked NFACC operations, the member-funded entity that has a board and an executive. Now for the second part of this presentation, an update on a major project that NFACC has undertaken that includes the update of 4 codes of practice, including the transportation code, which is so massive that it's like updating at least 4 codes all on its own. And I'll reiterate that NFACC operations are funded by those membership dollars. So when livestock and poultry groups approach NFACC to develop or update their code, NFACC applies through Animal Health Canada for project funding. And that's done to facilitate the code development or update process. And this is a competitive process. So there's never any assurance that we're going to secure funding for code updates. As it's done through project funding, it's a competitive process. There's no guarantee. We have to put together an excellent application, and we have to be able to justify the funds that we're applying for. So this project started in late 2018 when NFACC was under the Canadian Animal Health Coalition and was successful in its application to update 3 codes and develop a new farmed salmonids code of practice. And NFACC transitioned to being the Animal Welfare Division of the Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council in 2020. And the project also moved over at that point in time. Then the Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council transitioned to be Animal Health Canada, and NFACC's role under this new organization has not changed. The project ends this coming March, which is also the end of the CAP partnership. So before here are the 4 codes being developed as part of this project, and I'm going to provide some additional details on each. But before I do, I'll have a refresher on the codes of practice themselves. So NFACC oversees the code development process, as I already mentioned. So NFACC doesn't create the codes. We create the process by which those with the jurisdiction, influence, or responsibilities in farm animal welfare can come together to develop codes of practice. Codes are generally initiated by the national lead for a livestock or poultry group. So that national lead, on behalf of a sector, submits itself to NFACC's code process. And the codes that are produced through the code process then serve as our national understanding around farm animal care requirements and recommended practices. The challenge is in balancing requirements and recommended practices that are informed by the best science we have, while being practically implementable on all farms in Canada. So this is not about niche operations, what might be possible in a small segment of the sector. This is about what can happen on all farms in Canada. And then we have this tricky thing called addressing societal expectations for responsible farm animal care. So easy peasy, right? Figuring out what are society's expectations often depends on who you're asking. Finding that balance is critical given the role that codes serve as extension tools, the foundation for animal care assessment programs, and more as reference materials for provincial animal protection legislation and regulations. So in 2018, Industry initiated the development of Canada's first ever code of practice for farm salmonids, which includes salmon, trout, and char. The code's development was led by a committee of 14 people with expertise in aquaculture and fish welfare, including farmers from across Canada, government, animal welfare advocates, researchers, and veterinarians, all brought together to collaborate on this national standard. And this first ever code of practice was released in Canada. First code of practice for Canada was released in November of last year. Along with the code, what we heard, how we was released, and so this summarized input the public comment period and provided insights on how the public comment period, along with the top of mind survey that had been undertaken at the outset of this code's development, how both of those efforts inform the final code of practice. What we heard and how we addressed reports are a new feature of the code process, and the aim here is to provide greater transparency around how external input is addressed by a code development committee. The original GOAT code was developed in 2003 under the previous holder of the code process, CARC, or the Canadian Agri-Food Research Council. And while this slide says that the Canadian National Goat Federation initiated the GOAT codes update in 2018, that only really reflects when the code update was actually started. Prior to this, and even into the 2018 period, there was a whole lot of effort expended to ensure that CNGF was understood and acknowledged to be the designated national lead for this code, which covers goats used for dairy, meat, and fiber. So a whole lot of energy went into making sure that all of that was in place and that CNGF could really be the lead for the goat sector. The pandemic has certainly slowed our progress, but we are anticipating a new goat code to be ready over the coming months. So the most recent dairy cattle code was released in 2009, and the 2009 dairy code was the first code to be developed through what was then a new and improved code development process developed through NFACC when we were first getting off the ground. So dairy was the guinea pig back in the day. So for example, the 2009 code was the first one ever to utilize a scientific committee whose task it was to develop a report on research conclusions for key priority welfare issues. This was also the first code to undergo a public comment period. So we got around 200 comments that came in for that first public comment period, and it's funny because it felt overwhelming at the time, mostly because we didn't have a standardized system for receiving comments. That was a huge lesson learned. How do you even 200 comments coming at you in different forms can be quite the challenge. So now, given the current dairy codes, draft codes, public comment period, 200 seems like a drop in the bucket. But before the 2009 dairy code, the codes were also called recommended codes of practice, and the word recommended was dropped in recognition that codes could no longer be considered voluntary, in part because they do include requirements that are increasingly being used by the provinces to define generally accepted practices. And the look and feel of all codes have since been developed following the similar template for this first code that was developed through NFACC. And all these years later, and we have this update to the 2009 code that's underway, and the public comment period garnered far more attention than those 200 comments back in 2009. So 5,884 respondents completed a submission on the draft code. So this actually makes this the most commented on code of practice in NFACC's history. Additionally, organized submissions were received. So this is on behalf of associations, ministries, or councils. And in total, this code, when you break down all the submissions into their actual comments, 45,470 actual comments were received that the Code Committee has the challenge of reviewing and coming to consensus upon. The majority of responses came from Quebec, 48.7%, with British Columbia coming in second at 19.5%, and Ontario at 12.6%, rounding out the top three residences of respondents. Dairy farmers in particular, their voices. So 40 respondents identified as dairy farmers, and that's really unusual for our codes of practice. So kudos to the dairy sector for energizing their producers to offer their insights and input to the code. 31% of respondents identified as concerned citizens or animal welfare advocates, and 27% identified as consumers. All right, so now, oops, actually I jumped ahead a little bit here. The Dairy Code Committee is now super busy wading through all the feedback received with the aim of achieving consensus on the next iteration of the Dairy Cattle Code of Practice. It's going to take a lot of time to get through all of those comments and give them their just consideration. All right, so this code, the Transportation Code, aims to cover the transport of livestock and poultry on public roads and highways within Canada, as well as the care of animals at intermediary sites where animals are unloaded and reloaded as part of the transportation continuum, so auction markets, assembly yards, feed water rest stations, and all farmed animal species that currently have a code of practice are being addressed within this code. So this is the first code using the NFACC process that is not for on-farm use. It's also a code that was initiated by a collective agreement of NFACC's members, as opposed to a national stakeholder group. So in other words, transporters. And this is because of the lack of a national stakeholder group for livestock and poultry transporters. Transporters are definitely involved, but there are challenges that we've really become much more aware of associated with the lack of a national lead organization. The Code Development Committee is made up of 23 people, so it's a large code development committee. Add to this, there are 9 species-specific or sector-specific working groups, and that includes the Intermediary Sites Working Group, and these groups range anywhere from 8 to 15 individuals each. So this is a lot of people to engage on a code that carries great significance for many. Of course, the lack of in-person meetings due to the pandemic has created issues in terms of time delays, and then just adjusting in the early days to how to do virtual meetings and have virtual conversations and build these relationships. When the plan for this code was developed, it was recognized that we needed every inch of project runway from the 2018 right through the 2023 to complete this code. So unfortunately, the reality is that we are behind, we are delayed, and we are looking at Plan B options for getting this code to a final point. In the case of on-farm codes, provincial regulations are often not overly explicit or specific, and they often do look to the codes for interpreting fundamental obligations for animal welfare. So fundamental obligations for animal welfare. However, livestock and poultry transportation is subject to a robust regulatory environment, notably Part 12 of the Health of Animals regulations. And there's also an ever-evolving interpretive guidance used by CFIA to assist interpreting those regulations. So this code exists in an environment in which there are comprehensive Canada-wide regulations that specifically cover the humane transport of animals. And that has also created some challenges in determining code content and ensuring that we don't inadvertently end up being misaligned with the existing regulations. So a lot of challenges for this code. The current plan is to address the code's broad scope and content by splitting it into two distinct parts. So part 1, transportation of livestock and poultry. Part 2, care of animals at intermediary sites. And the part covering transportation of livestock and poultry is further split into 3 species type modules. The first module would cover livestock that typically walk onto vehicles. The second and third modules would cover poultry and smaller livestock species that are moved in containers. And ultimately, the goal is to publish a code that allows users to be able to target and access the specific transportation modules from Part 1 as needed, and or Part 2, which applies to the care of animals at intermediary sites. So the transportation the transportation code has many additional intricacies and considerations, but hopefully this very brief and high level overview is helpful. And I'm probably a little ahead of schedule, I think, but thanks so much for listening. And I hope I can answer any questions you have, but if not, I think there are some code managers in the audience who will also be able to help out if I'm not quite able to answer all your questions. So thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Jackie. I think as we do have quite a bit of time left, if you wanted to, if people have questions, either feel free to unmute yourself, or if you'd rather, drop them in the chat and we'll monitor that chat. So feel free to go ahead, and I will work on pulling up my presentation as well. So pop those questions in the chat if you wish, or unmute yourself. Great presentation, Jackie. Thanks so much.
No problem. Just looking through the chat, I see where everybody is from.
Yeah, we got people from coast to coast, which is kind of neat. And we had a question about whether or not the presentations will be posted afterwards. And yes, they are. All of the previous ones are posted on our organization's YouTube channel, as well as on the website. And then we will continue to we'll post Jackie's in the coming week or so too. So any questions? Oh, here we do have one here that I'm sure you've just seen there, Jackie.
Yeah, so should we expect a new code of practice for pigs soon? So first off, we are fully engaged at NFACC with all the codes and all the work that we have currently. So we have to bite off what we can chew first. The Canadian Agricultural Partnership funding program is coming to a close March 2023. So there's really no time to start any new codes or any new projects. And then we do have to wait to see what the next funding, next policy framework will look like, what are going to be the priorities there. And as you may have noticed throughout my presentation, I was really reiterating the importance of national lead organizations, initiating the updates to their codes. So we would always look to a national lead organization, and I think more and more we're seeing the value of that in terms of ensuring that the national lead is engaged, involved, and able to support a fulsome code update. And so, yeah, so that's a question I can't answer at this point in time, but we have our hands full, and we have to finish what we've already got on our plates for now.
Great answer. There's one other question here as well. Who is representing equine on the transportation code?
I don't, off the top of my head, know the answer to that, but I think there are a few folks from the Transportation Code team who might be able to answer that question for you. Sorry, Kelly.
Okay.
My brain only retains so much information, and all the 100+ people on the Transportation Code exceeds my brain's capacity.
Betsy here.
Oh, there's Bettina. I see Bettina. Are you the person?
I'm representing Equine for on behalf of Humane Canada.
Okay, thanks, Bettina.
And Betsy, I don't know if you had another answer there too.
Yeah, so this code isn't quite as simple as just saying who's representing what commodity on it, because as Jackie pointed out, we have a code committee that consists of 23 people, and we also have 8 species-specific working groups, and we have 1 sector-specific working group. So there is a working group that covers equine, and each working group was asked when the code committee was formed to assign somebody to be their representative on the code development committee. And for equine, my memory is correct. It was the staff person from Equestrian Canada is the
okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Betsy, for being able to be put on the spot there like that. Okay, and then we've got another question here. Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious about certain points on the codes. Are codes based on recent research? Are they based on Canadian livestock data? And is there a study of the economic impact of certain guidelines?
All right.
So 3 questions in one. So maybe we'll unpack the first one first. Where are the codes based on research, and are they based on Canadian livestock data?
So the short answer is yes, but so I talked a little bit about the scientific committee reports. So before a code when a code is being updated, parallel to that, we engage a scientific committee that is made up of a diversity of research expertise on the species in question, or the type of livestock or poultry for which the code is being developed. And we really hone in on what are the priority welfare issues for that particular type of animal. And so we look at what research has been done. And so the scientific committee does develop a report. It takes them about a year. So every code, if you go to NFACC's website, you'll see that there's, for every code developed, and including the transportation code, there's a scientific committee report. It outlines the priority welfare issues that were identified. And then the scientific committee then goes through those priority welfare issues. It determines what research has been done, what can we conclude from the research, and then puts together a report that summarizes all of that. And what's really important here is that the scientific committees do not, based on what the research concludes, then say, therefore, here's a bunch of recommendations. So this is a really important part of the code process, in that the science can tell us what is, but it doesn't tell us what we ought to do about that based on the science. So the what ought to be is a much more complicated question, and it includes like what's possible. If it's is it something that's practically implementable on farm? Science often only looks at one variable or 2 variables, and when you're living in the real world, there is a complex range of variables to be considered. So the conversation around, okay, here's what the science is telling us at this current point in time. What do we do about that? And that conversation belongs with the diversity of stakeholders that are around the table at a code development committee. So the farmers themselves that are going to have to implement this, the researchers for sure are part of that conversations, veterinarians, animal welfare groups, government, everyone who has some jurisdiction, influence, knowledge, experience, and needs to feed into the answer to the question. So we speak about codes being science informed versus being science based, because the reality is that none of us make decisions based on science. We often use the science to justify the positions we already hold on many topics. And so the trick is to take all this diversity of stakeholders and have them share their views, use the science to guide us, and arrive at a point where we can say what's possible, when is it possible, and how is it possible, so that we have codes that are able to be applied across the country. So that's a really long answer to your very brief question, but I hope that helps. And are they based on Canadian livestock data? Yes, where that's available. That's obviously the preference, our Canadian environment. But sometimes we do have to look beyond the Canadian research. We might be looking at North American research or even European research that's been done. But, recognizing where there might be some differences between a Canadian situation and other jurisdictions.
And then the other part of that question, Jackie, was that is there a study of the economic impact of guidelines or codes?
Generally, no. Though some sectors have done some economic analysis in relation to where some, post public comment period, even where some the impact of some of the requirements that are being proposed. And so that's an important consideration, but it's something that we don't do probably enough of to really ensure that all of the codes are also economically viable, as well as everything else that we're asking of them.
Great, thank you very much. And then one final question here before we, I don't know if there's any other ones. I'm not seeing a lot more in the chat, but if there is any other questions, please feel free to pop it in. What's the process to get somebody on board on those committees? So is there a process? So I'm assuming with this person's question, they're asking how does one become nominated, or how does one participate in a code committee?
So the whole code process is available from NFACC's website, so www.nfacc.com, and the whole process is outlined there. So typically what happens is, everyone, every stakeholder group that needs to be part of the code committee, we go to the national lead for that stakeholder group. So if we're looking for veterinarians, we go to the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association and we say, hey, who can be brought forward to sit on this committee with this expertise for this species. The livestock and poultry groups obviously identify their own producers to represent them. We go to either Humane Canada or World Animal Protection for representation from the animal welfare community. And so it's those national leads that we turn to and that the industry groups themselves work with to identify suitable representatives for each code development committee.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Betsy. I see you've dropped the URL for NFACC in there, which is great.
I think either COM or CA works, but yeah. But if we're being Canadian, let's say CA.
Okay, perfect. I'm not seeing any other questions, but if there are, please feel free to either unmute yourself or type in the chat, and I will pull up. There are a couple here. Okay. Is there an enforcement group to make sure the codes are applied in each industry or species? This is another question. This is a question from Neela Ben-Sassi from GBADS. Thanks, Neela. I hope I'm saying your name right. Go ahead, Jackie.
All right, so again, short question, longer answer. Yes, is the very, very short answer, but livestock and poultry production is largely, animal welfare is largely a provincial jurisdiction. So each province would have their own, if you're talking regulatory enforcement, each province will have its own animal protection legislation and its own enforcement groups. And each province then also utilizes the codes in its own way in terms of whether they directly incorporate them by reference, whether they use them as reference material. So it's a very complex picture in Canada, given our jurisdictional layout. But as well, in terms of enforcement, a number of livestock and poultry groups also have animal care assessment programs. And in some of those sectors, those programs are mandatory. And so that would be another mechanism by which the codes would, because all the animal care assessment programs are based on the codes as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, I don't see any other questions in here. So thank you very, very much, Jackie. And then also, I think I just mentioned you by first name, but Betsy Sharples has also joined us here with them. And Betsy is leading the transportation code. So thanks for joining us, both of you, and thanks for a wonderful presentation. Our next piece of the afternoon is going to be an update from Animal Health Canada. So I'm going to pop up my slides. So you'll just see a blank screen for a moment while I get my things up. Okay, great. So thanks very much for having me today and sticking around for the presentation around Animal Health Canada. Today, and again, I'm Dr. Melanie Barham, the Executive Director for Animal Health Canada, previously known as the National Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council. So just to give you a timeline of Animal Health Canada's initiative and our transition initiative specifically, is I know there are people joining us who may not have a background in Animal Health Canada or the National Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council. So this slide specifically speaks to our Animal Health Canada transition to become this new organization and realize a new vision and mission. So the council has been in existence since 2010, but in 2018, the Animal Health Canada Working Group was struck external to council to try to reimagine what collaborative work and problem solving and shared accountability would look like in the context of emergency management, as well as animal welfare and animal health. And in 2020, the Animal Health Canada Working Group did a gap analysis of the current landscape of governance and decision making. And in May 2020, they did a governance study to look at models in comparison for public-private partnerships. And over the course of this time, it became more and more clear that the National Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council was the right place to land for Animal Health Canada as an initiative. And in September 2021, so just last year, the members of the council accepted the new model and new name, as well as the concept of Animal Health Canada. And so they voted to formally change the name and accept a new vision and mission. In December, they decided to do a governance and strategic plan proposal to bring about we have a vision and mission, we've got a rough idea of governance or a rough plan of governance, but we need something more detailed, and we need a much more detailed strategy for how we're going to realize this vision and mission. So in January, we did a funding call for the final governance and strategic plan project, and that's leading us up to our next slides here. One of our driving factors is that the agriculture ministers of Canada have specifically noted Animal Health Canada as an initiative that they are interested in seeing continue or interested to hear more about. And we've been requested to bring an update on progress for the July 2022 ministers meeting, which is our big deadline as we're moving towards. To look at our, this is our French slide, sorry. So if you're confused, I apologize for this. So it's come up as a French slide, apologies. Or at least on the title anyhow. So just to give you a schematic, because it is a little bit confusing as we've changed our name. So in 2018 to 2021, our organization was called the National Farmed Animal Health and Welfare Council, and the Animal Health Canada Working Group operated alongside of Council. We were the conduit for the communications, as well as the project funding, etc. And assisted them in their work. And in 2021, we continue to operate side by side, although we've changed our name to Animal Health Canada. And then our vision and goal is in 2022 to bring that working group and the members internally to Animal Health Canada as our membership expands. As we look at our project timeline, you can see this is a very high-level Gantt chart of our project timeline of what we're planning to do and what we're planning to achieve. So with our strategic plan, I'm going to talk a little bit about that soon, but we're planning to release that in May. The governance study is going to be released probably later in June, but potentially into July, depending on how the project timeline goes. We're aiming for June, though. Rebranding has begun. And we've also, under the communications piece, adopted these webinars that you're attending right now, and then also these report cards or progress reports that we're releasing monthly as well. And our second one was set to release next week. So if you're not on our mailing list, I'll give you share with you how to do that later. We've also been, as we know that there is a need for a new vision and a mission and a call to be a bigger organization, or an organization that embraces more collaboration and more shared decision making, we recognize the need for solidifying and advancing our infrastructure and our operations to be able to meet that need, while maintaining a lean organization that is that's able to keep to a relatively small budget. And then financial modeling has also begun as well, and we're working on that to be able to bring to conclusion at around the same time as the governance and strategic plan are released, to be able to give a fulsome picture of what Animal Health Canada will look like in the future. With regards to our governance study, we have selected a firm. Our primary consultant is Janice Riven, who is a lawyer, an MBA, and also is a professor at Concordia, and she teaches on governance at Concordia University in Montreal. And her company, Governance and Compliance Solutions, was chosen by RFP. A draft report for governance has been prepared and presented to the Animal Health Canada Working Group for consultation. And the same thing will go to and a revised report will go to the Board of Directors May 12th, and then we'll proceed forward with further discussions about where that might go from there. Our strategic plan, a stakeholder survey, was completed in March, and it was sent to over 200 groups across Canada. And actually, when I really add them up, it was probably closer to 300, but we'll say 200. We'll say 200 to be on the safe side. Virtual sessions were held March 21st and 28th of over 40 stakeholders, and we had really great engagement on that. And then our plan, the draft plan, has been consulted on through the working group, as well as the Board of Directors and Animal Health Canada staff, as well as the attendees of the strategic planning session. Those attendees included federal, provincial, territorial agencies, Animal Health Canada members, and Animal Health Canada working group members, as well as the Dean's Council of Agricultural and Veterinary Colleges across Canada. Our final report is going to the Animal Health Canada Board of Directors this next week for final decision, hopefully, unless there are other revisions. And we hope to be able to publicly release this and share some more details in the coming month. Other actions and updates, our governance and strategic plan, as I mentioned, will inform our financial model and our budget moving forward, and how costing will be determined. And then our rebranding is underway. And then our second progress report will be released next week. And if you wish to sign up for that or aren't on our mailing list already, you can go to our homepage and scroll right to the bottom, and there's a little spot to contact and sign up for our mailing list. That's the big update from Animal Health Canada, and I hope to be able to share some additional updates in the coming months with some more juicy details about our strategic plan and where we're going as an organization. So, but happy to take any questions before we go into our breakout rooms for some networking. So, if there are any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them. And if you are sticking around for our breakout rooms, the networking has been a lot of fun. It's been really interesting to hear the conversations from across the country and to get some networking in with with colleagues around the country. If you do have questions, we'll wait another minute before jumping into our breakout rooms. Okay. Not hearing any, I am going to start our breakout rooms. And the first question I'd love for you to answer, introduce yourself, of course, in your breakout rooms, and then feel free to share something that you might have, based on either Jackie's presentation or mine, something that made you curious or that made you want to learn more